The morning mist clung to the dense forests of the Ardennes like a shroud, masking the greatest military deception of the Second World War. It was December 15th, 1944, and Private First Class Tommy Morrison of the 106th Infantry Division pulled his woolen coat tighter as he peered into the ghostly tree line. From his foxhole near Schnee Eifel, the 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa had been told this was a quiet sector, a place where green troops could get their feet wet without facing the full fury of the German war machine. How wrong they all were. Across the misty expanse, hidden beneath carefully constructed camouflage nets and within reinforced bunkers, over 200,000 German soldiers waited in absolute silence. SS Oberskruppen for Joseph Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, General Hansel von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, and General Erich Brandenburger's 7th Army had assembled for Operation Wagd. A.M. Rhein Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The Allied intelligence had been catastrophically blind. Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps held an impossibly thin line, stretching over 80 miles through the Ardennes, with units scattered like seeds across the rolling hills and dark forests. The 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments of the 106th Division occupied positions that should have been held by an entire corps. Colonel Hurley Fuller, commanding the 110th Infantry Regiment, had expressed concerns about the extended front to his superiors, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. The Ardennes was considered a backwater, a place where battle-weary veterans could rest, and new arrivals could learn the ropes of combat without serious threat. The Germans, according to Allied intelligence, were finished as an offensive force. As reported by war correspondent Hal Boyle of the Associated Press in his later accounts, the American forces had been lulled into a false sense of security by weeks of relative quiet. Along the Belgian-German border, even the usually cautious General Omar Bradley had relocated his headquarters to Luxembourg City, confident that the primary German threat lay to the north around Aachen or to the south near Metz. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Reed, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 424th Infantry Regiment, conducted his evening inspection with routine casualness. His men were spread across a sector that would normally require 3 times their number to defend properly. Many were teenagers barely out of basic training, their faces still soft with youth, their hands still awkward with their M1 Garand rifles. The veteran NCOs among them survivors of Normandy and the brutal fighting through France sensed something amiss in the unusual quiet that had settled over the German lines. Sergeant Mike Kozlowski of Chicago, a grizzled squad leader with the 28th Infantry Division, had noticed the absence of the usual German patrols and the strange lack of artillery fire that had marked previous weeks. But for most of the American soldiers settling into their frozen foxholes that December evening, the greatest concerns were staying warm, receiving mail from home, and wondering when they might get their next hot meal. The 106th Division's chaplain, Captain Joseph Kuhn, had even scheduled a Christmas pageant for the following week, confident that the holiday season would pass peacefully in their sector. As darkness fell across the Ardennes forest and temperatures dropped below freezing, Tommy Morrison and thousands of his fellow soldiers tried to catch what sleep they could. None suspected that across the valley, German assault troops were already moving into their final attack positions, preparing to unleash the bloodiest battle in American military history, a battle that would claim over 19,000 American lives and earn its place in history as the Battle of the Bulge. At precisely 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, the earth itself seemed to convulse as 1,800 German artillery pieces erupted in simultaneous thunder across the Ardennes front. The massive barrage, stretching from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, shattered the pre-dawn silence with a violence that could be heard 50 miles away. Private Morrison jolted awake in his foxhole as the first shell screamed overhead, their demonic whistle growing to a crescendo before exploding in blinding flashes that turned night into day. Tree branches, frozen earth, and shrapnel rained down as the concentrated artillery fire sought to obliterate the American forward positions. In those first terrible minutes, entire companies simply vanished beneath the hurricane of steel and high explosive. The German searchlights suddenly blazed to life, their brilliant beams reflecting off the low-hanging clouds to create an artificial daylight that illuminated the battlefield in ghostly white. This technique, perfected on the Eastern Front, was designed to disorient and blind the defenders while providing illumination for the attacking. forces. Through the artificial dawn came the rumble of tank tracks and the mechanical growl of hundreds. A vengeance. The German Armor King Tiger tanks, Panthers, and the massive Jag Panzers emerged from the forest like prehistoric monsters, their long guns already belching flame as they engaged the stunned American positions. Behind them marched the infantry, their field gray uniforms barely visible in the dancing shadows cast by the searchlights. And exploding shells dot Colonel Mark Devine's 14th Cavalry Group, positioned along the Losheim Gap, or the initial brunt of the assault. His light reconnaissance vehicles and thin screening force were simply swept away by the German 6th Panzer Army's overwhelming advance. Within hours, entire units had been surrounded, scattered, or destroyed, leaving gaping holes in the American defensive line. As documented in military historian Hugh Cole's official U.S. Army history, the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, the initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise, with American units reporting impossible sightings of German armor in areas that intelligence had deemed secure. At the regimental command post of the 422nd Infantry, Colonel George Deschenaux tried desperately to establish communication with his scattered battalions. Radio calls went unanswered, telephone lines had been cut by artillery fire, and the few runners who attempted to reach forward positions never returned. The fog of war had descended with a vengeance, leaving commanders blind to the true scope of the disaster unfolding around them. Major General Alan Jones, commanding the 106th Infantry Division, received fragmentary and contradictory reports throughout the morning. Some units reported minor patrol activity, while others described massive tank attacks. The communications breakdown made it impossible to distinguish between genuine threats and false alarms, a confusion that would prove catastrophic in the hours to come. Captain Charles MacDonald of the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment, later described the surreal quality of that morning in his memoir. His company, positioned near the town of Krinkelt, found themselves facing what appeared to be the entire German army. Panzerfaust streaked through the morning air like comets, and the distinctive whine of German Nebelwerfer rockets added their terrifying voice to the symphony of destruction. The American artillery, caught completely off guard, struggled to respond. Effectively, many batteries had been positioned for defensive fires along expected avenues of approach, but the German attack came from unexpected directions and with overwhelming force. Battery commanders found themselves calling fire missions on positions overrun before the rounds could impact. By noon, German spearheads had penetrated up to 6 miles into American-held territory. The twin villages of St. Vith and Bastogne, crucial road junctions that controlled movement through the Ardennes, were already under threat. General Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army pressed forward with ruthless efficiency, while von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army executed a brilliant flanking movement that threatened to encircle entire American divisions. As the short December day began to fade, thousands of American soldiers found themselves cut off behind enemy lines, their units shattered, their communications severed, and their supply lines cut. The greatest American military disaster since Pearl Harbor was unfolding in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, and the worst was yet to come. The ancient Belgian town of St. Vith, with its cobblestone streets and medieval church spire, had weathered centuries of European warfare, but nothing had prepared it for the mechanized fury that descended upon it on December 17, 1944. The vital road junction, where 7 major highways converged like spokes of a wheel, had become the focal point of German offensive ambitions and American defensive desperation. Brigadier General Bruce Clark arrived in St. Vith with combat command B of the 7th Armored Division just as the first German reconnaissance elements were probing the town's outskirts. A veteran of North African and Italian campaigns, Clark immediately recognized the tactical nightmare unfolding before him. His force of Sherman tanks and armored infantry would have to hold a perimeter against elements of 3 German divisions, while simultaneously trying to rescue the scattered remnants of the 106th Infantry Division. Colonel Deschenaux's 422nd Infantry Regiment had been completely cut off on the Schnee-Eifel, a ridgeline east of St. Vith that had become a death trap. Over 3,000 American soldiers found themselves surrounded by German forces, their ammunition running low, their supplies exhausted, and their hope fading with each passing hour. Radio messages pleaded for relief, but none would come. The German news tightened methodically round St. Vith as General von Manteufel's armored spearheads bypassed the town to the north and south, seeking to encircle not just the garrison, but the entire American force in the region. Panzer Division, the Führer Escort Brigade, and elements of the 2nd Panzer Division converged on the town. Like wolves closing in on wounded prey, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Erlenbush, commanding a task force of Sherman tanks and tank destroyers, established a defensive perimeter on the high ground overlooking St. Vith. His M for Shermans, outgunned by the German Panthers and King Tigers, relied on superior numbers and aggressive tactics to hold their positions. The familiar crack of high-velocity tank guns echoed through the valleys as American and German armor engaged in deadly duels among the frozen forests. Inside the town, civilian refugees streamed westward in pathetic columns, their worldly possessions loaded onto farm carts and wheelbarrows. Belgian families who had welcomed American liberators just months earlier now fled in terror as the German army returned with a vengeance. The sight of these desperate civilians only hardened American resolve to hold the vital junction at all costs. As documented in the combat narratives compiled by the U.S. Army's Center of Military History, the defense of St. Vith represented one of the most tenacious delaying actions in American military history, buying precious time for Allied reserves to mobilize. Staff Sergeant Robert Billings of the 18th Tank Battalion exemplified the American fighting spirit during those desperate days. When his Sherman tank was disabled by a Panzerfaust hit, he continued to fight from the burning vehicle until the ammunition exploded, taking several German infantry with him. Such individual acts of heroism became commonplace as American units found themselves facing impossible odds. The German assault on St. Vith intensified on December 18th. As fresh divisions joined the attack, the dreaded Waffen-SS units, veterans of the Eastern Front, brought their ruthless efficiency to bear against the American defenders. The distinctive camouflage patterns of SS uniforms became a familiar and feared sight among the snow-covered pine trees surrounding the town. General Clark faced an agonizing decision. As German pressure mounted from all directions, his communications with higher headquarters had been severed, his ammunition was running critically low, and his casualties mounted with each German attack. The choice was stark: attempt a fighting withdrawal that might save his remaining forces, or continue to hold St. Vith and face complete annihilation. By December 20th, the German ring around St. Vith had become impenetrable. American supply convoys attempting to reach the garrison were ambushed and destroyed, their burning trucks lighting the winter landscape like funeral pyres. The town's medieval buildings began to crumble under concentrated artillery fire. As German forces prepared for the final assault, the fate of St. Vith and the thousands of American soldiers defending it hung in the balance as the bloodiest phase of the Battle of the Bulge entered its most critical hours. Time was running out for the besieged garrison, and with it, perhaps the entire Allied position in the Ardennes. While St. Vith burned under German assault, 70 miles to the southwest, another drama of equal intensity was unfolding around the market town of Bastogne. The ancient crossroads, where Roman legions had once marched and Napoleon's armies had passed, was about to witness one of the most legendary defensive stands in American military history. Acting Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division had arrived in Bastogne with his paratroopers on December 19th, just hours ahead of German spearheads racing toward the town. The Screaming Eagles had been hastily pulled from their rest area near Reims, France, still wearing summer uniforms and lacking proper winter equipment for the bitter cold that gripped the Ardennes. General von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army had identified Bastogne as the key to their entire offensive. Control of the town's 7 major roads would allow German armor to surge toward the Meuse River and ultimately toward Antwerp. Without Bastogne, the German advance would bog down in the narrow forest tracks and secondary roads that crisscrossed the Belgian countryside. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, deployed his men in the forests east of Bastogne as German reconnaissance elements probed the American perimeter. These veterans of Normandy and Market Garden knew they faced a desperate situation, but their confidence remained unshaken. They had stopped the German army before, and they would do it again. The German forces converging on Bastogne represented the cream of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division brought overwhelming firepower to bear against McAuliffe's hastily prepared defenses. German artillery began registering on American positions as tank columns moved into assault formations. Captain James Parker's Charlie Company of the 501st Parachute Infantry held a crucial sector along the Longville Road, where German armor would most likely attempt to penetrate the American perimeter. His paratroopers, armed with bazookas, rifle grenades, and grim determination, prepared to face the panzer columns in a battle they could not afford to lose. The civilian population of Bastogne found themselves trapped in the middle of the impending battle. Families huddled in cellars and basements as German artillery began to fall on the town. The local hospital, overcrowded with American wounded, continued to operate under the most primitive conditions as medical supplies ran dangerously low. As detailed in war correspondent Walter Cronkite's dispatches from the European theater, the siege of Bastogne captured the American public's imagination and became a symbol of the nation's determination to achieve victory regardless of the cost. On December 22nd, German emissaries approached the American lines under a white flag, carrying an ultimatum for the besieged garrison. The message, typed on official Wehrmacht stationery, demanded the immediate surrender of all American forces in Bastogne. To avoid total annihilation, the German commanders were confident that their overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower would force a quick capitulation. General McAuliffe's response would become one of the most famous in military history. After consulting briefly with his staff, the acting division commander penned a single-word reply that captured the defiant spirit of his surrounded paratroopers. Nuts. The German emissaries, puzzled by the American slang, required a translation before understanding that their surrender demand had been emphatically rejected. The German reaction was swift and violent. Artillery fire intensified dramatically as Nebelwerfer rockets shrieked into the town, their explosions sending clouds of brick dust and debris cascading through the narrow streets. The medieval church bells of Bastogne tolled continuously, their bronze voices mixing with the thunder of guns in a funeral dirge for the dying town. Sergeant Bill Garnier of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, exemplified the fighting spirit of the besieged paratroopers. Despite suffering a severe leg wound during a German attack, he continued to direct his squad's defense until he was physically carried from the battlefield. Such determination would prove essential as the Germans prepared their final assault on the surrounded garrison. As Christmas Eve approached, the fate of Bastogne and, perhaps, the entire Ardennes offensive remained in doubt. The paratroopers had held against overwhelming odds for 5 days, but their ammunition was nearly exhausted, their casualties mounted steadily, and no relief appeared on the horizon. The most critical test of American resolve was yet to come. 200 miles to the south, in the frost-covered fields around Metz, France, Lieutenant General George Smith Patton Jr. paced like a caged panther. In his 3rd Army headquarters, the mercurial commander, whose armored spearheads had been driving toward the Saar industrial region, received orders on December 19th to execute one of the most audacious strategic pivots in military history, turned his entire army 90 degrees north and raced to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. "We can attack in 3 days," Patton declared to his stunned staff officers, who understood the enormity of the task before them, moving over 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and hundreds of artillery pieces across icy roads. In the depths of winter, while maintaining combat readiness would test the limits of military logistics, most commanders would have requested a week or more. Patton demanded it be done in 72 hours. Major General John Milliken's 3rd Corps would spearhead the relief effort, with the 4th Armored Division leading the charge north through Luxembourg toward the surrounded paratroopers. Combat Command A, under Brigadier General Herbert Ernest, would advance along the Ardennes-Bastogne highway, while Combat Command B would attack through the villages of Bernin and Chaumont. The German commanders recognized the threat posed by Patton's advance and deployed significant forces to block the relief effort. The 5th Parachute Division, reinforced by elements of the 4th Grenadier Brigade, established defensive positions along the likely American approach routes. German engineers worked frantically to destroy bridges, create roadblocks, and plant mines that would slow the American advance. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, led the spearhead toward Bastogne with his characteristic aggressive style. His Sherman tanks, their treads wrapped with chains for traction on the icy roads, pushed forward through villages still occupied by German rearguard forces. The familiar rumble of tank engines and the clatter of tracks on cobblestones announced the approach of American armor. The weather, which had favored the German offensive by grounding Allied aircraft, began to clear on December 23rd. For the first time in a week, American and British fighter bombers could provide close air support to the ground forces. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, and North American P-51 Mustangs swept down from clear skies to strafe German columns and attack enemy strong points. According to military historian Carlo D'Este's comprehensive study patent, A Genius for War, the Third Army's pivot north represented one of the finest examples of operational mobility in the European theater, demonstrating Patton's exceptional ability to maneuver large formations under extreme conditions. Captain Jimmy Leach of Charlie Company, 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, described the desperate fighting along the approach to Bastogne in his post-war memoir. German Panzerfaust streaked from concealed positions in the forests, while American tank destroyers engaged German armor in deadly duels at point-blank range. Every village became a battlefield, every hill a fortress to be stormed. The German defense stiffened as American forces drew closer to Bastogne. General Heinrich von Leutwitz's 47th Panzer Corps was ordered to hold the ring around the town at all costs, even as other German units continued their advance toward the Meuse River. The battle for Bastogne had become as much a matter of prestige as strategy for both sides. Inside the besieged perimeter, ammunition had reached critical levels. American artillery batteries were rationed to essential targets only, while infantry units conserved their remaining rounds for close-range defensive fighting. Medical supplies were virtually exhausted, forcing surgeons to operate without proper anesthesia and to reuse bandages from the dead. Staff Sergeant Horace Woodson of the 94th Field Artillery Battalion exemplified the resourcefulness of the Bastogne defenders. When his howitzer ran out of high-explosive shells, he improvised anti-tank rounds using white phosphorus and time-delay fuses, successfully knocking out the German armored vehicles. During a particularly intense attack on Christmas morning, December 25th, Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division launched its final assault toward Bastogne. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Abrams' Tank Battalion, the American spearhead smashed through German defensive positions at Saint-Ouen, a small village just 4 miles south of the besieged town. The sound of Sherman tank engines had never been more welcome to the surrounded paratroopers. At 4:50 in the afternoon, the first relief column broke through to the Bastogne perimeter, ending one of the most famous sieges in American military history. But the Battle of the Bulge was far from over, and the bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. The relief of Bastogne on December 26, 1944, marked a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. But the German offensive was far from finished. General von Manteufel's armored spearheads had pushed deeper into Allied territory than any German force since 1940, and forward elements of the 2nd Panzer Division had advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse River at Ardennes. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper's-Kampfrup, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had carved a path of destruction through the American lines. Before being stopped at the town of L'Église, Piper's King Tiger tanks and Panther mediums, running critically low on fuel, had been forced into a defensive perimeter as American forces closed in from all directions. The town of Mannheim, positioned at a crucial crossroads northeast of Bastogne, became the focus of renewed German attention as von Manteuffel sought to salvage something from his stalled offensive. The capture of Mannheim would provide the Germans with a direct route toward Liege and threaten the rear areas of the American First Army. Major General Matthew Ridgway's 18th Airborne Corps had been assigned the mission of eliminating the German salient, a task that would require coordinated attacks by multiple divisions across difficult terrain. In the worst winter weather Europe had experienced in decades, the 82nd Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General James Gavin, would attack from the north, while the 3rd Armored Division struck from the west. The German forces defending the salient represented some of the finest units remaining in the Wehrmacht. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, despite heavy losses in Normandy, still possessed considerable fighting power. These teenage fanatics, indoctrinated from childhood in Nazi ideology, fought with a desperation born of both belief and the knowledge that surrender often meant death at the hands of enraged Allied soldiers. Staff Sergeant Francis Curry of Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, earned the Medal of Honor during the fighting around Malmedy when he single-handedly attacked a German strongpoint, destroying 2 machine gun nests and killing or wounding 21 enemy soldiers. Such individual acts of heroism became increasingly common as American units fought to compress the German salient. As documented in the official U.S. Army history, compiled by the Center of Military History, the elimination of the Bulge required some of the most intense fighting of the entire European campaign. with American forces attacking uphill against determined defenders in sub-zero temperatures. The weather remained brutally cold, with temperatures dropping to 20 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. American soldiers suffered thousands of cases of frostbite and trench foot, while vehicles required constant attention to prevent fuel lines and hydraulic systems from freezing. The wounded faced particular agony as morphine froze in medical. Syringes and blood plasma became useless ice. Captain Charles Bogartis of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment led his company in a desperate night attack against German positions near Trois Ponts, armed with Thompson submachine guns and fragmentation grenades. His paratroopers fought house to house through the village against SS troops, who refused to surrender. The battle raged until dawn, with both sides taking severe casualties in the savage close-quarters combat. The German Air Force made a final, desperate effort to support the ground offensive with Operation Bodenplatte, launched on New Year's Day, 1945. Nearly 1,000 Luftwaffe fighters and fighter bombers attacked Allied airfields across Belgium, France, and the Netherlands in an attempt to destroy Allied air power and give German ground forces breathing room. The air attacks achieved tactical surprise and destroyed or damaged several hundred Allied aircraft on the ground, but the cost of the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. German losses included over 300 aircraft and, more critically, experienced pilots who could not be replaced. The operation effectively ended the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. For the remainder of the war, Lieutenant Robert Woods of the 69th Tank Battalion described the final German attacks near Hofelice as the most intense fighting he had witnessed since the Normandy breakout. German assault guns emerged from the morning fog like prehistoric monsters, their long guns already blazing as they engaged American tank destroyers in deadly duels. Across frozen fields. By January 8, 1945, coordinated American attacks from north and south had compressed the German salient to a narrow corridor. Around the town of Hofelice, German resistance remained fierce, but ammunition shortages and fuel problems increasingly hampered their defensive efforts. The dream of reaching Antwerp had died in the snows of Belgium, and now German commanders focused on extracting as many of their forces as possible. Before the corridor was completely severed, the bloodiest American battle of World War II was entering its final phase, but the constant human suffering would continue to mount as both sides prepared for the climactic struggle that would determine the fate of Hitler's last great gamble. In the west, the Belgian town of Hofelice, its ancient stone building scarred by weeks of artillery fire, became the symbolic endpoint of Hitler's desperate winter offensive. By January 16, 1945, patrols from the 3rd Armored Division advancing from the north made contact with elements of the 11th Armored Division pushing up from the south, effectively cutting the German salient in half and trapping thousands of enemy soldiers in a rapidly shrinking pocket. General Hassel von Manteuffel, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, had already begun withdrawing his most valuable units toward the Siegfried Line defenses along the German border. The 5th Panzer Army, which had penetrated furthest into Allied territory during the offensive's early days, conducted a fighting retreat through the same villages and forests they had conquered. Just a month earlier, Lieutenant Lau Bokov, the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 99th Infantry Division, had spent 3 weeks in German captivity after his small unit's heroic stand at Lanzerith had been overwhelmed on the first day of the offensive. His 18 men had held off an entire German regiment for a crucial day, delaying the advance of the 6th Panzer Army and contributing to the ultimate failure of the northern prong of the attack. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was staggering. American casualties totaled over 89,000, including 19,000 killed in action, making it the bloodiest single battle in United States Army history. The proud divisions that had entered the Ardennes in December emerged as hollow shells, their ranks filled with green replacements, who would carry the psychological scars of the winter battle for the rest of their lives. German losses were equally severe, with over 100,000 casualties and the destruction of irreplaceable reserves that had been assembled for the offensive. More critically, the Wehrmacht had expended its last strategic reserves in the failed gamble, leaving Germany virtually defenseless against the Soviet winter offensive that was already beginning to unfold along the Eastern Front. Captain John Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Allied Commander, visited the battlefield in late January as a member of his father's staff. The younger Eisenhower was shocked by the devastation he witnessed. Entire forests reduced to splintered stumps, villages completely destroyed, and the frozen corpses of both American and German soldiers scattered across the snow-covered landscape like broken dolls. The strategic consequences of the German defeat extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The failure of the Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves, shortened the war in Europe by several months, and ensured that when the final Allied offensive began in the spring, German resistance would collapse with stunning rapidity. As documented in Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower's post-war memoir Crusade in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated both the resilience of American forces under extreme pressure and the importance of maintaining adequate reserves to counter unexpected enemy initiatives. Sergeant Bill Garnier of the 101st Airborne Division, who had lost his leg during the defense of Bastogne, later reflected that the battle had transformed his unit from a collection of individual soldiers into a brotherhood forged by shared suffering and mutual dependence. The paratroopers who survived the siege would remain connected by bonds stronger than family for the rest of their lives. The small Belgian town of Henry Chapelle became the final resting place for over 7,000 American soldiers who died in the Ardennes. The pristine white crosses and stars of David that marked their graves stood in silent testimony to the price of freedom and the courage of young men who had answered their nation's call. It is darkest our Private First Class Tommy Morrison of the 106th Infantry Division survived his captivity in German prisoner of war camps and returned to his family farm in Iowa after the war. He rarely spoke of his experiences in the Ardennes, but on quiet winter evenings, when snow fell on the cornfields and the wind howled through the bare trees, his family would sometimes find him staring out the window with the distant look of someone remembering battles fought long ago and friends who would never come home. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when the last German units withdrew across the Our River into Germany. The bloodiest American battle of World War II had concluded with complete Allied victory, but the price paid in human suffering would echo through the decades that followed. In the snow-covered forests of Belgium, a generation of American soldiers had proven that democracy could triumph over tyranny regardless of the cost, and had secured for posterity the freedom that future generations would inherit as their birthright.